Hello, welcome. Just going to give it a few moments while people trickle in. Thank you for joining us today. If you're just joining us, we're just kind of waiting for attendance to kind of level off here. So we'll start in just a moment. And I think it's starting to kind of level off. So I might just get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Textile Preservation Tips and Tricks. My name is Greg Stewart, and I'm the Education Program Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA. I use they and he pronouns. For accessibility's sake, I can say that I am a white person with glasses. I'm wearing a blue shirt, and my screen is blurry, but you can kind of see the door behind me. Just a little bit more about today's program. So one of our most requested webinar topics is how to care for your textile collections. So we're really excited to be able to deliver on that request today. Today we're joined by Textile Conservator and CCAHA board member Annabelle Camp, or Belly as she goes by. And she's going to discuss proper methods for textile documentation, labeling, and terminology. And she also addresses preventative care, including storage, handling, and common pests that you might face. Um, so before we get into the presentation, just some Zoom housekeeping. You're in Zoom webinar, which means that your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. This program is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we're going to have the presentation from our speaker today, followed by Q&A with you. But please feel free to ask questions anytime during the program, and we'll get to them at the end, and I'll be reading those questions verbally roughly in the order that they come in. So that's how we'll do Q&A. The program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording as well as a PowerPoint and any resources that we've shared in a follow-up email. And I want to say a big thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, who, through their funding, have made today's program possible. So, Belly, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Thank you. Just one quick note about the organization I work for, CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based here in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do at our website, ccaha.org. So a little more about our speaker today. Annabelle Camp is an MBA candidate at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, focused on building financially sustainable models for the arts and creative sectors. Prior to her MBA, she led marketing and development at the Balboa Art Conservation Center, where she managed the organization's fundraising and external communications. At Wharton, Annabelle has consulted, on strategy and development for the University of Delaware's Department of Art Conservation, the National Gallery of Art, the Barnes Foundation, and Arts Fund. Annabelle has an MS in Art Conservation from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in Art Conservation and maintains a private textile conservation practice. She serves on the board, as I mentioned, of CCAHA and lives in Philadelphia with her husband and two dogs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Belle.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, everybody. It's so lovely to see so many places represented in the chat. And I am hoping that those two dogs leave us alone during this. Fingers crossed. But anyway, thank you all so much for joining from across the country. Um, as Greg mentioned, today we're going to talk a little bit about documentation and terminology, preventive care, pests. We're going to go over a lot. Please do put questions in the chat and we'll save time to address them at the end. But first, when we talk about textiles, it's really important to, be able to use the right words for them. And what I love about being a textile conservator is that there are textiles around us all the time, unless you're a nudist. There are textiles in your lives every single day, and there's no shade to nudists, but I don't know that there's any in this call. So I just want to take 1 minute and encourage everyone here and you can put it in the chat, you can write it next to you, whatever you want to do, and just write about a textile either in your museum's collection or around you today, in your office or your home, and just write a one sentence description of what it is. So I'm literally just going to be silent for a minute. Feel free to write it or put it in the chat, and we can go from there. Give it a few more seconds. There's so many great descriptions coming in. Okay, thank you so much for everybody that has put descriptions in the chat. Um, if we look at these, we see so many different identifiers. Some people have identified the century in which the textile is made. We see a lot of 18th and 19th century things here. You've identified textile types. So we have uniforms, caps, shoes, quilts. A few of you identified materials. We have silk here. We have cotton. Like we just so many different describers. We have things about printed fabrics, collage, which is referring to how it was made. I'm very intrigued by this strawberry, Mary Todd Lincoln silk strawberry dress. Like so many different ways to describe textiles. Um, and why document textiles, right? When we think about any object, we want to document it so that someone who comes in next year, 5 years, 100 years from now, knows what we're talking about in our collection, and is able to identify any changes that might have occurred since it was last documented. And with that in mind, it's really important to make sure that we are using, as much as possible, consistent language. And when we're documenting textiles, we want to identify both the description, so describing what the textile is, what it's made of. So again, going into the fiber type, the fabric type, which many of you did, the structure, how is it put together? Is it a flat textile? Is it, a garment? And does it have previous alterations? Then there's the condition description as well. So identifying whether there's damages and if those damages are structural or visual. And then how likely is it to maintain its current condition? Is it stable with its current damages? Or do we anticipate that to change over time? And these are all important considerations when we're looking at a textile. And I apologize because I realize that I'm talking about descriptions and I didn't do my visual description, Greg. So for accessibility, I am a white woman. I have short brown hair, and today I'm wearing a bright orange dress. So here we go into the textile description. I'm wearing an orange shirtwaist dress with a collar. You can't see the shirtwaist, but for structure. And I'm in a white room in a black chair. So I apologize for not doing that sooner. So when we look at textiles, when we're documenting them and using this terminology that we're going to go into, some useful tools, and a few of them are included in this image here, include a magnifier or thread counter. So that's the black sort of square frame that you see in this image. It's really useful to be able to look at the weave structure, to even get a thread count. This can be valuable for understanding history, historical context, measuring tape. Always we want a measuring tape to get dimensions. A micro spatula is a very useful tool, particularly if you're trying to access maybe tight areas or lift fragile textiles, for example, or like corners. Tweezers can be helpful if you're trying to get, again, into small spaces or pick up very small pieces. But your most important tool, honestly, is clean hands. And as textile conservators, we very rarely use gloves. It's very important to be able to feel the textile. Like textile comes from the Latin for to touch, and we want to be able to touch it, to feel how the fibers are flexing, if they're shedding, and we'll go into all of these terms. But your hands can really tell a lot, and your fingertips can tell a lot that a glove unfortunately prohibits. There are instances where gloves would be helpful, and we'll talk about that as well. But really making sure you just have clean hands, reduce your hand oils, and use those. It's valuable when discussing condition to have a rating system. I won't go through all of the steps here, but typically like a poor to excellent rating system is valuable, and having some sort of framework that so that you can put this in an appendix of a examination report, condition report, so that someone in again 5, 10, 100 years would be able to look and say, okay, this is the criteria that this person was using when they said that this hat was in excellent condition. Like, I don't think it's in excellent condition now. What might have changed? It's also important to consider a culturally significant condition. So some things that might qualify a textile as poor condition, say a stain, might be culturally or historically significant. So is that stain evidence of its use? Is it important to the story that the textile tells? When we are documenting textiles, there are a variety of methods. The first and foremost is using photography. A picture truly speaks 1,000 words, and you can also use different types of light to tell different stories. So this is an image of a silkwork embroidery from the collection of the Winterthur Museum. On the left is just a normal, light, direct image. This is a very complicated piece, and you get a pretty full story in what's happening on the surface using just a image. On the right, this is a raking light image, and raking light, just truly changing the angle of the light, can tell a lot more information. So here we have a number of creases that you can see that you couldn't see in the raking light. So this tells a lot more. Other forms of light that you can use include UV light, which might be able to show different material types because they might have fluoresce differently, excuse me, or even identify stains that aren't visible to the naked eye. Other documentation methods include maps. I think maps are super useful, particularly when there's complex condition or description that words would really struggle with. So for example, this piece has a lot of stains around the perimeter, and you could say it has stains around the perimeter, or losses. You could count those and say it has, 20 losses on the left side. But honest, that is helpful, but it's also really helpful to say this is where they are in case in 5 years someone comes and there's a new one and they can see, oh, it wasn't marked in this map. These are very easy to make. You can, even just print out an image and draw directly on it and then scan that in. I use PowerPoint. You can use iPads and draw on images that way. Really, whatever you find to be the easiest is what I would suggest doing. Another method is to create line diagrams. These can be very useful, particularly for complex weave structures or construction. These are particularly helpful when you think about describing a complex garment structure. But even with a flat textile like the one shown here, an image alone didn't display that this is actually made up of about 6 or 7 different textile fragments. But by drawing a map and identifying those through a key made this much much more legible to someone. And this prevents them from having to, someone, a curator or a conservator in the future, from having to come in and take this whole textile apart or take it off of its mount. They can look at the map and be like, okay, now I see where the different components are, where the seams are. All of this different construction can be identified in a map and limit handling in the future. And then also words can be really helpful, obviously. And one thing that I note is always try and do a combination of different documentation methods because people process information differently. And it just helps for legibility and accessibility to have different documentation methods incorporated in your work. But if it's a very straightforward issue or construction, I sometimes words and a simple picture are enough. So this boot has a large loss. You can see the loss. I can tell you it's on the right side of the right boot, and you would be able to identify it. And as long as there's measurements to help sort of locate and track it, that should be sufficient for future use. So really, it is dependent on the object type, but by using different modes, you can sort of cross-check yourself in the future. When we're talking about those written descriptions, it's very important to have consistent terminology. And I'll go through this terminology. These are sort of different buckets. And I just want to say here, you will receive this PowerPoint. So if things are unclear now, do not worry. And again, always happy to answer questions as well to clarify. But what's most important, I would say, in all of this is to be consistent and to make sure that in your own work, you're using the same terms to describe the same things across time and pieces. So when we talk about physical and structural condition, which I would say comes first. You always want to address the physical and the structural before you start talking about the visual, in part because that has the most implications on its long-term care. And it's as a conservator, it's what we want to prioritize in a conservation treatment. So the first thing is handling qualities. This is literally how does the textile feel? If it's safe enough to pick up and touch and move. Is it flexible? Is it not flexible? It's a little bit brittle, maybe it's stiff. You can see if something is shattering or powdering. Shattering is when there's actual breakage. So that silk work, it was shattering. You wouldn't pick that up and move it. Powdering is where the fibers are degrading and you get little bits of like fiber dust. You can kind of see that on the white background. This is an archaeological textile. It actually was fairly flexible, but when you moved it, the fibers were so degraded, it would release this powder. Next is structure and how to describe compromised structure. And think of sort of when we talk about complete structure, this is beyond surface level. This could include a tear or maybe something got cut. Is it split, which is where the fiber has degraded to a point it started to come apart? Is there a large loss or has it been punctured, creating a hole? So these are all different terms. When we look at this specific stuffed animal, this dog's name is Leonardo, and he's actually owned by another CCAHA board member. Leonardo had a lot of condition issues, as you can see. But one thing to note here is like, for example, on his head where there's missing fabric, that I would describe as a loss. But on this red square right on his side in the middle, the fabric has degraded to a point that it started to split. And at his leg or on his tail where it's really ruptured, that is torn, like it's just ripped open. You could also say it's ripped or the seams have come apart, but that is where the fabric has torn. When we think about compromised structure more on a partial or surface level, some of the terms that we can use here include abrasion. And so you can see this on the blue fabric of Leonardo's foot where the fabric has started to fade. This has, he's been well loved in his life. He's been rubbed, and over time that does abrade the surface of the fabric. And typically that appears either through thinning of the fabric, so you might actually be able to see more through, like see more light through a fabric, or loss of dye and print. which is what you see here. Fraying, which again, Leonardo's got all of the condition problems, super helpful for this. Fraying is where, you start to get the fibers coming up. Maybe they haven't been completely lost, but they're starting to lose their weave structure. And then pilling, we probably all have this on a sweater, is where, little balls of fiber are starting to form. And that is due to actual loss of fiber or damage of fiber on the surface of a material. So it is structural, although it's not nearly as drastic, say, as a tear. There are also condition concerns associated to storage and use. I think we are all familiar with creases. I have some on my dress today, and these can be from storing in our closet or sitting on our garments during the day. And the same thing goes for materials in collections. They can be creased from long-term storage or have creases from evidence of use in the past. Fold lines, similar to a crease, but just like a little bit more specific. Fold lines are detrimental long term to textiles because at the tension point where that fold occurs, the fibers are compressed. Over time, that can lead to fiber damage and even loss. So on this textile, which is a wool textile, so the pink is wool on a linen support, which is the brown. This had been folded at one point, now it's rolled, but where it had been folded, that very harsh crease, that fold line, had caused damage to the point of loss. So the wool had actually broken and we had holes at that point. Um, Depending on how an item is stored, the fold line is also exposed to more moisture, it's exposed to more air, it's exposed to more grime. So you'll also tend to see discolorations on a fold line as well, which is what you can see on the linen of this piece. So you can see this dark line sort of carries across onto the linen support. The linen was strong enough, it didn't break along that line, but it has discolored because it likely was facing outward on a shelf. There's also distortion related to storage. So again, like thinking about our own closets, sweaters, if you hang them up, right, they're going to distort over time due to the weight and the flexibility of the knit material. The same thing can happen in our collections. So think about a large rug hanging on a wall. Over time, it will start to sag and distort, and that's due to the weight of the material. We also wanted to make sure that we're discussing any stitched or applied elements. So you want to identify broken, loose, or missing stitches. Check the seams of garments. Check the seams of quilts, for example, and identify any previous repairs or mends. Often these are historical. Sometimes they're not. Maybe you've had a conservator or someone make alterations in your collection in the past. And it's very context dependent as to whether or not you would want to reverse those mends. But typically, if they are historical mends, you just want to make sure that they're documented so someone in the future doesn't think, oh, this may have been a conservator in the past. But these can often suggest areas of fragility. So again, making sure that they're noted and identifying how and maybe when they would have been done if you know that. Once you have the structural set, you want to then talk about the visual condition. Visual condition, again, can include evidence of storage and use. I think we all are familiar with staining. Yellowing is typically something you'll see on white or undyed textiles. This is natural degradation that can be slowed, and we'll talk about that in the preventive conservation section, but definitely you want to identify any evidence of yellowing or discoloration. Grime, typically identify as just like regular dust buildup. So something might appear gray or darkened. Tide lines, which you can see here. A tide line is caused by water incursion on a textile. So what happens is something gets wet, the water carries grime or dirt, or maybe a dye or other material inherent to the textile to the edge. And when it dries on that edge, it creates this tide line. Accretions are things that might be on the surface. So think about wax on a tablecloth. That would be considered an accretion. Corrosion, this is also actually visible in this textile. So corrosion, aka rust. Many textiles either have metal components, maybe a zipper or a grommet, or in this case, this textile was nailed to a support, and over time, those nails rusted and caused corrosion to stain the textile. And residues as well, which could be from a variety of materials, whether it's modern adhesive residues, maybe from a previous pour mounting, or historic residues that might be significant to its use. You also want to note finish. A textile can have either an applied finish, such as a starch, which will make it appear shinier and also have a stiffer hand, or it might have a finish that is more physical and created during manufacturing. So think about burnishing. So just describing whether something is matte, glossy, a light sheen, just really looking at how it reflects light can be valuable in describing how it has aged as well. And then also there's a variety of visual terminologies related to pests. So fly specks are dark spots associated, like very, very tiny. Think about like the point of a pin, which is fly poop. Foxing, which can be seen here, resembles like a mold or mildew stain. It's typically a brown or orange stain, most visible on white textiles, but it doesn't just occur on white textiles. And then we'll get into some of these other things such as moth casings, frass, and grazing, which is evidence of pest damage. You definitely want to keep an eye on any of that and clean that if it's in your collection. And then of course mold as well. The bottom four, I would say if you see those, you want to act faster than the top two, but we'll get into that right now. We're just describing them. And then there's also visual condition concerns associated with dyes and prints. So fading, if something has discolored, you want to make sure you're noting that. Crocking is where the dye has either been worn off, and that could just, you see an area of lighter or braided dye in a localized area, or maybe it's crocked onto another textile in your collection. And then dye bleed or transfer. So this is an example of dye bleed in this image. This embroidery got wet, and unfortunately, primarily the blue dye, although we also see some with the orange dye, were not water fast and unfortunately spread within the white textile. And if not stored properly, this could also bleed to another textile. So you might see that, or another object. So you want to identify that as well. I know I've thrown a lot of terms at you, and the most important thing I would say is to be consistent. So try and use the same terminology throughout your collection. You want to clarify whether you're talking about the viewer's left or right. I would say in the majority of textile instances, we are, versus the proper left or right. That is more common, I would say, with costume, for example. So when you're talking about the left sleeve, it is the left sleeve as though you are wearing the garment. So just making sure that you are clarifying what you're referring to. You want to try and make educated material guesses if you can, but always, state that it's an educated guess unless you know for certain what a material is. So say it's likely cotton or estimated to be cotton because of the period and the sheen and maybe the historical context. So try and add some of that reasoning to your descriptions whenever you can. Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so are diagrams. So use them, but also use them in a way that is helpful. 1,000 pictures that you have to identify, like, where is this dark brown spot on the, that's not helpful. So being consistent in your labeling and making sure that images are as useful as possible for the next viewer. As I said before, always use at least two different types of documentation. So whether that's word and pictures, maps and pictures, again, depending on the issues that you're trying to capture. And then clear descriptions of what you see are always better, in my opinion, than using a common term incorrectly. So some common terms like brocade and tapestry, we might have an idea of what that is, but in many cases that varies across region, and also that can be misconstrued. So in many instances, people will identify like any wall hanging as a tapestry, but a textile conservator, a tapestry is a very specific type of weave. So some of these terms, if you don't, I would say try and avoid them, and instead just saying, I see two to warps going over to wefts, or, really just painting as clear of an image of what you're seeing and not assigning terms to it will help the next person in the future. And of course, any documentation is better than none. So while I've thrown a lot of terms at you today, and maybe you don't want to learn how to make a map on PowerPoint, fine, that's up to you. But anything, even a brief description like we started today's exercise with is better than nothing. And so I'm not going to take the time now, but I do want you to think about the object that you identified at the beginning of this exercise and think about how you would be able to describe it with these terms, and whether that would make it slightly more clear to the next viewer, now that we've gone through this than before we started. And all of these resources will be shared with you. So now that we've been able to identify and describe textiles, it's really valuable to think about how to prevent those many condition issues that we talked about from happening in the first place. So as a textile conservator, I'm trained to fix those tears, mend those splits, all of that, but I would love for them not to happen in the first place, which is where preventive care is so important. We want to stop that from happening. So when we think about preventive care, we think about the entire environment that a textile is stored in, how it's handled, how it's stored, and even might seem like small actions like labeling, but can have a really long-term profound impact. So you're thinking about climate. You're probably maybe familiar with other recommendations around temperature and relative humidity. And generally, those same rules apply to textiles. However, benefit of the doubt here for textiles is that they are a little bit more resilient to temperature, as opposed to maybe paintings or wood. And again, we all live with them, we're familiar with them, and they're pretty hardy for the most part. However, you do want to avoid sustained high or low temperatures and avoid rapid fluctuations, as this can cause damage and increase fragility of a textile. Relative humidity, ideally, you want to keep it between 40 to 60% RH. At high relative humidities, textiles are prone to mold growth. You can see on this image here, was originally a white textile. It's part of a piece by Christos and Jean-Claude that had been stored in uncontrolled climate and grew mold, which is this black staining on the side. So you get mold at high, you get embrittleness at low. So trying to keep things relatively calm at that 40 to 60 range is ideal for textiles. And again, this might vary a little bit on the textile type, but these are general best practices. Light exposure is probably a textile conservator's biggest enemy, I would say. Excessive exposure will lead to fading or discoloration, and I think we've all seen this in our personal lives. Maybe your curtains, maybe you have a pillow near a window that has faded over time. It also leads to fiber damage, which ultimately can then cause splits and tears. So even after something has faded, it will continue to degrade physically. Certain dye stuffs, certain dye colors are more susceptible than others. So, if you have a lot of this is a historic red garment, they're particularly prone to light fading. You want to be extra careful with those, but as a general rule, there are some tips for all textiles to consider. And most importantly, remember that light exposure is cumulative. So think about it as a debit account. So every little bit of light is taking away from your textile's debit account. Even if you're not seeing light fading, it is being extracted over time, and eventually it will start to fade. I know that sounds a little bit scary, but to mitigate light exposure as much as possible, choose LEDs, because they don't emit UV. If you have objects near a window, across from a window, and you can't move it, add UV filters to those windows. Use UV filtered plexi where you can if it's a frame textile. You want to avoid halogen lights because they introduce heat. And rotate textiles that are on exhibit. Again, even if you are using the best lighting practices, you are adding or taking away from that light account that the textile has, and there's no way to get it back. And as textile conservators, we can't re-dye something or reapply a color. You, again, don't want to display directly in front of or across from windows, and ideally store textiles in light-proof storage enclosures or spaces without windows. Darkness for storage is ideal. This image shown here is actually from a mount. So this was I think it was a cotton mount, and you can see where the object was. This is the dark outline of the object. That was the original color of the mount. So you can imagine the light exposure that this object received, which is far from ideal. So again, making sure that things are being rotated off display and put back into storage when possible. Handling and mounting, I would say, is often when the most physical damage occurs to an object. When you are handling a textile or any object for that matter, you want to make a plan. So ensure that table surfaces are prepared and cleared. You want to make sure that your pathway is cleared if you're moving an object through a space. And consider whether the object can fit through a doorway, especially if we're talking about maybe a large rolled textile. How are we going to handle this tube? Can the object fit on a cart, or can it be hand carried? Do I need partners to make this move? If so, make sure that you walk through or discuss who's doing what, who's opening doors, all of those considerations before you start. And then what are your support materials? You can, if a textile is fragile or large, you definitely want to make sure that you're using support materials. You can use rigid supports if it's a small enough textile. If you have a small embroidery, for example, you could put it on a blue board or another rigid support. If it's a large textile, maybe a folded quilt, for example, or a coverlet, you can use secondary textile slings. So literally wrap it in a sheet or a towel, and that will help to distribute the tension and the weight of the piece as you move it. Think of like a hammock. So you don't want to pick a textile up by one corner or one point like you see on the left. Instead, you want to try and distribute the weight. If you can't see or you don't know the fragility of something, try and lift it carefully. Here, Elizabeth is shown using a bone folder to access the underneath the textile and make sure that, okay, this is safe to be lifted. So just making sure that you're being considerate, considering the fragility of the textile and supporting it wherever and however it needs. When storing textiles, there are a variety of different methods that we can use. Sorry. So different housings include flat files and shelves. If something is on a shelf, ideally it would be in a box, again, to protect from light, but also fluctuations in temperature, fluctuations in RH, dust. Any enclosure just helps to mitigate all of those factors. You also might use hanging racks, or in this instance, we see an image of butcher's carts, which are valuable if you need to move around in a storage space. You could very easily roll these without having to lift up every single box. Blue board boxes are ideal. However, if you can't afford blue board boxes, or maybe your textiles are in a space prone to moisture incursion, you can also use polypropylene storage containers. And then padded hangers are also really valuable, and we'll talk about those as well. So the first storage option is, are we going to fold this? Will it be stored flat? Will it be hung, etc.? So good candidates for folded or flat storage include very fragile textiles. You would never want to hang a fragile textile. A small textile, because it is, it can fit on a shelf without taking up too much room, or in a box. Flexible textiles, such as a knit or a crocheted piece, you would want to fold as it's more prone to distortion from hanging. And very heavy textiles as well, you wouldn't want to hang because they're also prone to distortion. Again, think rugs, or they're also good candidates for rolling depending on the size. Something with a lot of embellishments as well, which would add weight, you would want to make sure you're storing folded or flat. When folding textiles, as we see here from this example from Winterthur, you want to try and pad the folds to prevent those fold lines that we discussed earlier. So here you can see these white sort of sausage-like materials. These are polyester batting just in cotton stockinette. So these are both materials that you can find at a craft store. Stockinette you can even find like at Walgreens in the first aid section. These are great because they don't hold moisture. If they got wet, say in the instance of a flood, they would still hold their shape and they wouldn't stick to the textile itself. They're more reusable and they hold their shape in general. So you can use tissue paper as well. However, tissue paper over time loses its shape. It has to be thrown away, and it does hold moisture. And in worst case, if your items are in a flood, tissue paper can actually stick to the collection object, adding more issues in recovery. So this is often a faster alternative, but long term it's less sustainable. Good candidates for hanging include framed textiles, obviously. If you have something in a frame, um, hang it, save yourself some space. Clothing that has minimal adornments or layers, so basically something that's lightweight and won't get distorted or tear over time. And textiles in good condition. Generally, we don't want to hang very fragile textiles, as I said, as the weight of hanging over time will lead to damages or tears. If you are hanging garments, actually you can see here, this textile, which is incredibly light, it's a very fine cotton dress. You can see it's on this very chonky hanger. This is a padded hanger, and the reason that we use these is to distribute the weight and reduce that risk of tearing and damages. So, as well as creasing or distortions at the shoulder. You can buy pre-made padded hangers, however, they are rather expensive. You can also make them fairly easily. You can buy, again, you can buy archival hangers. That would be ideal as a base, but they do have a higher price point. So this is showing a wooden hanger. Wood does emit acids, which if in direct contact with the textile can lead to staining. So shown here, you can see that the wood hanger has been wrapped with aluminum foil, which adds protection and prevents leaching of wood acids into the textile object. The padding or the shape of the hanger is built up with polyester batting and fabric, and then the entire piece is covered with cotton stockinette again. And you just have to sew these at the end. They're very simple to do, and there's a how-to video as well in the introduction. This is a great project for an intern. It's just like if you need a fun sewing activity, this is very therapeutic, I think. Good options for rolled storage include large flat textiles, maybe a sari, or rugs. And again, heavy textiles are good candidates here for this. When you're rolling a textile, you want to make sure that you have cradles, so you can support the ends of the tube. You don't want the tube to be stored just resting on the textile itself, as that will cause distortions. You want to consider the tube diameter and weight in relation to the textile. So you don't want something super narrow for maybe a large rug. You want to roll along the length of the warps. And if it's something with a pile or nap, like a rug or velvet, you want to roll that with it facing out so that you don't crush the pile. And then as you saw in this picture here, the tube extends beyond the textile itself. This is critical for hanging, or excuse me, not hanging, for handling so that you're not touching the textile. Also, if you do need to use cradles to support the ends, the cradles are touching or blocks are touching the tube and not the textile. So again, you don't get uneven pressure on the textile itself. Um, when you're considering mounting, the same considerations for storage types can be applied to mounting. Mounting techniques vary, again, on the textile needs, as we've seen, as well as the budget. You can spend thousands of dollars on a custom mannequin, or you can buy a dress form and modify it yourself. And I think the same rule applies to any mounting type. The most important thing is that you're trying to support the textile as evenly as possible. So when hanging textiles, you want to ensure that the weight is spread evenly across the top. So as you can see with these quilts, here you don't see any like distortions along the top. These are probably mounted with a Velcro piece that goes along the back. You can also use a rod by stitching a rod sleeve onto the back of a textile, and that prevents any sort of uneven points of pressure along the top of a piece. The same sort of rule of spreading tension applies when mounting costume. You want to ensure that the shoulders, the bust, any points of pressure on the garment are appropriately supported and padded, and try and just distribute that tension. So when mounting, you want to use archival materials wherever possible. So polyester wadding is a great material to build up the support, as well as cotton stockinette again, to sort of hold everything in place, and it creates also a bit of friction that holds a garment in position. So these are very cheap materials, but you can create appropriate mount supports this way. And again, lots of materials, lots of videos to reference here for this. And the last thing I wanted to note just on sort of preventive care is labeling. So this is, I know it feels like you're sewing and it feels a little bit interventive, but labeling is so important for objects tracking, making sure that, numbers don't get lost and the archival information doesn't get lost. Ideally, I would suggest using sewn-in labels, and there's a whole how-to video that I've made linked here. And again, you'll have access to these resources that walks you through this. This is important because there's less risk of loss if it's sewn in, and something like a paper tag that might be pinned in place can degrade over time and you lose that essential tracking information. And I'll just very quickly go through pests. Pests, again, I think like light textile conservators have a specific beef with. When we talk about common pests within textile collections, these are kind of the three main culprits. So carpet beetles, a carpet beetle shown in the second image, that's the adult beetle. Those will not harm your collection objects. However, their larvae will. So these little fuzzy guys on the left eat proteinaceous fibers, so wool, silk, fur, and feathers. The same appetite goes to the clothes moth, which is shown on the right. Clothes moths, you might see them flying, but the larva is actually the problem. If you see a flying moth in your collection, definitely be on alert. These are going to eat those same types of materials, while silverfish actually eat starches. So starch fabrics might be delicious meals for a silverfish. When So I know many of you probably have pest traps. This is great. Obviously, if you see any of these in your traps, you want to check your collections, and you can start by looking at these culprits. It's also important to note that pests might be attracted to food stains, no matter what type of material they're on, as well as grime. And grime contains a lot of skin, so these protein eaters are really going to be attracted to that, which is all the more reason to keep your storage and exhibit spaces clean and food-free. For the sake of time, I won't go into all of the identifiers for pests, but I do just, again, these resources are here and I'm happy to go into it in the Q&A. This is moth evidence. One thing to note about moths is they will burrow deep, like they'll go to the base of fur. So if you do suspect a moth infestation in your collection, make sure that you're like agitating the fur. Don't just look at it and say, okay, it looks fine. Check some of the dark, maybe under a collar, a sleeve, or a seam, because they want to get like in the dark corners where they won't be disturbed or found. So definitely look there. The last thing I just want to note is that pesticides are common in textile collections, particularly, historic anthropology collections. Heavy metals were often used. If you have a pest infestation and maybe there's a set of objects that weren't affected, I encourage you to be wary of that. If you suspect any sort of heavy metal presence or pesticide presence in your collection, contact a conservator. CCAHA can advise on this, and always wear PPE like gloves when handling those textiles. And just to note with pesticides, mothballs are a pesticide. Mothballs I know are very common in personal collections, historic collections. They are poison. They're made of a material called naphthalene, which is a known carcinogen. If a textile smells like mothballs, I encourage you to allow it to air under ventilation or in an open room that's not being used by people with proper air exchange until a smell is no longer detected. Even if you don't detect a smell, but you know something was stored with mothballs or it smelled like mothballs before, make sure to label that textile enclosure because the residues can remain. And you always want to wear PPE with a textile that has been mothballed. So finally, I know I've thrown a lot at you. You can do so much of this by yourself, but we are here to help. So when should you contact a conservator? Um, if there isn't a collection emergency, such as a fire or a flood, please reach out to any conservator. If you suspect or want to confirm the use of pesticides, again, this is something that we can advise on. If you're mounting or even rolling a highly complex or fragile textile or preparing it for storage, again, contact a conservator. Unfortunately, that tends to be when the most damages do occur to objects, so we want to prevent that as much as possible. When new damage occurs, or in the event of a pest infestation, contact a conservator for sure. Or if you just have any of these questions about this or anything we've discussed today, tend to be a very helpful group, and we are here to help you protect your collection. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I will leave time for questions, and I apologize because I feel like I just ran through so much information.
Thank you so much, Belly. That was amazing. And just very thorough and very comprehensive and kind of clear. So I really appreciate that. Um, we already have some great questions in the chat, so I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but I want to try to get to as many as we can here. So our first question that I see in the chat is this kind of back to the description part. Is there a standard format for textile description documents, or does it vary from institution to institution? Is there a globally recognized standard for, artifacts that travel between continents or conservation traditions?
No, unfortunately, there's not a globally recognized standard. There's some standards around terms, but even that is up for debate. So the answer is no. I tend to follow similarly to how I presented of describing the structure and the visual separately. And hopefully that is as clear, like just making sure that things are as clear as possible because there is no standard is my go-to method. But it is very institution dependent, and some institutions, their reports might be two sentences, and others it might be multiple pages.
Thank you. Yeah, it does seem to be the lack of standardization is probably something our field needs to work on
I know
broadly.
some people that are working on it, but TBD.
Yeah. Um, Next question. Are there any recommended surfaces or table covers that work best for handling textiles?
Great question. Um, Honestly, I think just as long as you have a smooth, clean surface, I tend not to cover tables. Like a white, smooth, clean surface is ideal because you can see anything that's on it. Um, but sometimes that's not possible. I wouldn't work on like a waxed or polished wooden surface. If that's the instance, I would cover it. And if you are covering a table, I tend to recommend Tyvek, which you can order online. If you wash it, it's much easier to work with, and you can actually sew it and make table covers with that. And again, because it's washable, if it gets grimy, you can remove it and wash it, but it will hold up a little bit more than like a typical like cotton fabric, and it won't hold as much dust either. I know
Um,
that there's some other private conservators in this chat, and if they have table covers that they like love, I encourage them to respond as well.
Thanks. Do you have any, I know you had a section at the beginning about some tools of the trade, but do you have any recommendation of must-haves of equipment or supplies as we examine handle
Yeah.
textiles?
Definitely a thread counter or magnifier, and I feel like everyone has their own preferred magnifying tool, whether it's optimizers or a thread counter. So some sort of magnification, a flashlight. I'm trying to think of the things I always take on like site visits. Um, I mean, always having some pins, entomology pins are a must-have, I would say, which are very fine pins. Okay, a measuring tape, of course, which I mentioned. And yeah, some tool like a bone folder or a micro spatula, as I mentioned, in case you do need to like lift a corner or get into a small space that you don't feel comfortable with your hands alone.
Awesome, thank you. Next question I see, could you touch on buffered versus unbuffered storage materials?
Absolutely. I tend to recommend as a rule unbuffered across the board. Um, so buffered materials have an additional alkaline material added to them, which helps to counteract acid buildup. The problem is that this material, the added material can interact with certain dyes. And unless you have a really strong understanding of dye types in your collection, that's always a bit of a risk. So I generally just recommend unbuffered. I also, for like tissue, for example, I think unbuffered tissue is a little bit softer, and is that therefore safer. The one downside of that is that they will, I mean, both of them will, but unbuffered will do this faster, will absorb acids in your collection, so you do have to replace it eventually.
Hmm. Our next question that I see, should you check boxed or rolled textiles periodically in your collection or leave unless you see damage to the box or the roll?
Yes, I mean, but that could be years, between regular checks. I would say if you're doing everything right in the environment, like have pest monitoring, more broadly in a space, I wouldn't worry about it. Um, Rolling is a very and unfolding are very, especially unrolling, are very hands-on activities. So you do want to try and minimize it as much as possible, which is why sort of doing larger environmental controls will save you that hassle.
Um, do you have a template that you use to share on documenting the textiles, or if there, this might be something in the resources, to include with the item that informs others that may handle?
So yes, I have a template. I kind of modify it a little bit depending on the client and the object, depending on need. But I think there might be one in there, a sort of a base sort of tombstone template. And if not, I'll add one. Because that is helpful. I would say definitely if you're looking for templates or guidelines, use that condition assessment table that I included. And always you want to add description of the object as well as so just on its own before you start discussing the condition. It's important to segregate those out.
Nice. And I think we have some responses, Belly, to your question about other conservators in the chat, sort of recommending some different surface materials. So thank you for that. We have cotton sheets, smooth, clean, uncovered table, um, etc. And so we have a couple more minutes. I just want to see if there's any last questions. Otherwise, we can adjourn for the afternoon. I think we'll take maybe one or two more questions.
I did see someone asked about mothballs.
Oh, did I miss that one?
No, it's
Thank
okay.
you.
I feel very strongly about mothballs, so I wanted to address it. Please never use mothballs. Um, in your personal collection, in your storage collection, they're a health hazard to yourself and to conservators. So that is why, and yes, they protect against moths. If in your own home you're worried about moths, I do recommend like using the cedar balls or cedar things. You can also put things into like polypropylene bags or polypropylene containers, and that will prevent incursion of moths. But if you have mothballs in your collections, I recommend disposing of them using proper like OSHA recommendations because they are carcinogens and they take a long time to get rid of.
Oh, thank you. I think last question here. Do you have any experience to manage climate control in textile collections in tropical climates? Have you
Really good
seen
question.
any differences from say Philadelphia, our country's climate?
Yeah, so I don't have personal experience in these climates. I would say trying to use like the polyester materials instead of tissue is a really good place to start, because that tissue paper will hold moisture, and in a tropical climate, there's always moisture, right? So just simple things like that will reduce like the relative humidity within your textile sort of microclimate. Also, you can add sort of desiccants to help draw in moisture as well if that's an issue. The only thing to consider with that is that making sure that you're either regenerating those or replacing them as they do get exhausted.
Nice. Well, thank you. I think we're just about out of time. So just a big thanks to you, Belly, for this great talk this morning. And thanks to Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. We want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities again for sponsorship and to all of you for showing up today. So our next webinar will be Turning Assessment Recommendations into Action, how to make practical use of assessment reports on May 29th at noon. And if you happen to be in the Philadelphia area, our spring open house is May 20th at 5 p.m. So we hope to see you at one or why not both of those events.
Mm.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.